Good afternoon. I'm Grace Spees, Executive Director of the Farmers Branch Chamber of Commerce. Today we have a very special guest with us. His name's Tim Barton. His father founded Wallbuilders, which is an organization designed to preserve and continue on the history of the Constitution and the foundation of America. So I might have butchered that, but Tim, go ahead and just elaborate and share a little bit about, what you guys do, both in the historical context and as
Yeah,
it pertains to today.
absolutely. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. Really appreciate the opportunity to be with you and your group today. So our organization is a faith-based organization. Our name is Wall Builders. We take that from a Bible book called Nehemiah. Nehemiah was one of the Jews who was part of the Babylonian captivity. And while there, he was really grieved in his heart, looking back at Jerusalem and how his city, his nation had come under attack and been destroyed. And Nehemiah was the guy who led the effort to go back and rebuild the nation, rebuild the city of Jerusalem. And that was really kind of what my dad felt impressed many years ago, back in the 80s, looking at America and seeing some of the moral decay, seeing issues in the education, seeing just kind of across the board things that didn't seem right to him. And in the midst of kind of him feeling impressed to want to do something to help rebuild America structurally, what we say is rebuilding it from the moral, the constitutional, the biblical perspective. But in the midst of all of that, what he discovered was that as he began to study original documents from the founding fathers, that a lot of what he studied, a lot of what he was reading in their own handwriting was contrary to much of the narrative that he had heard about who they were and what they believed and what their value system was. And it led him to start collecting original documents to where now we have what's considered the largest private collection of original documents from the founding era. We have more than 100,000 artifacts, documents, whatever kind of paraphernalia you might imagine from back before 1812. And so we're able to do a lot of research from their own writings, their own documents, their own proclamations, and see what they actually said and believed. And so instead of just looking at Wikipedia or looking at what some professor might say, we try to study their original documents. And what we've discovered from their original documents is that even though the founding fathers certainly weren't perfect and a lot of them had a lot of issues, they really did a lot of extraordinary and exceptional things for America at a time when it was not normal in the rest of the world, to set America on a trajectory to be quite unique and special. And that's where you can look in the history of the world. No nation's really enjoyed more stability, more prosperity, or more freedoms than we have even in America today. And so that's a lot of what we do, is talking about a lot of the historical perspective. But the name comes from a Bible book, and as a pro-faith, pro-family organization, that's kind of up the alley we go.
Awesome. Real quick, I think your mic might be hitting your jacket a little bit. We're
It
getting a
probably
little
is.
bit of
Sorry.
feedback there. That's okay. Just want to make sure our listeners can hear you. So let me get this straight. You speak both English and Old English very well.
I read Old English very well. Yes.
That's got to be interesting in and of itself, going back in time to, I mean, from my understanding, you guys have read and combed through journals and people's handwritten
Absolutely.
letters, and really taking you to a time and place that's unlike, today's world and society.
Very much so. And, one of the things about living in modern culture is a lot of times we feel so advanced because our technology and our technological breakthroughs are absolutely astounding and amazing, how far we've come in a couple hundred years. What we now see with medicine, right, just across the board, it's amazing how far we've come. With that being said, when you go back and start reading some of the founders' writings, something like the Federalist Papers were written for the farmers of New York. And at that time, the farmers were considered the uneducated, or the least educated people. And if you read the Federalist Papers today, it's like reading at a graduate level textbook. It is amazing how educated they were in academic circles, that today we lose some of that perspective. But as you go back and read some of those writings, you really do get impressed. Certainly as they're using quill pen and ink, many of their penmanship was so exceptional. Some of it looks like it ought to be a computer font on some level. So it is fun studying some of the old documents and just seeing some of those nuances that we wouldn't really think about today. But absolutely, their writing ability, their penmanship, several things that are very impressive from early America.
I can only imagine. And I imagine you get kind of the soap opera of early America as well.
Very much so. Yeah, a lot of drama. Sometimes you look at the political climate today and people feel like that, man, what we're going through today is crazy and it's so extreme and it's so different. And it's like, really, if you go back, when you get after President Washington and you get to a John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, those dudes were bitter rivals in early America. They were friends going through the Revolution. And then when America becomes a nation under the Constitution, they become political rivals and just hateful, vindictive toward each other. It's not till late in life they become friends again. You can move just a couple presidents forward to John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. And it's interesting studying history. Sometimes we feel like that we're going through things that are brand new historically. And the reality is these really aren't very much new things. It's just we've forgotten history where moments like this happened in the past. Even where we're looking today, the fact that there's still questions and President Trump is still challenging legally what's going on. And people are going, oh my gosh, bro, two camps. One camp's going, it's over, concede, right? Joe Biden, president-elect, he's the next president. One camp's going, no, we think there was so much fraud, don't concede. And we even feel like this is a new thing. You can back up 20 years to the Bush-Gore, right, presidential debate. And it went on for 37 days before there was anything decided. But you can back up before that. And when you look at John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson, neither one of them had the electoral votes they needed to win the presidency. It went to the House of Representatives to be president. You can look at the Rutherford B. Hayes presidential election, the same scenario, going to the House. So even where we are politically today is not brand new territory. It's just that because most people don't know history, we think we're having to deal with situations and issues that nobody's dealt with before. It's actually not a brand new situation, which is also one of the cool things about learning more of the Constitution and the application of the Constitution, because the founding fathers actually put in the Constitution the process to resolve these very disputes and conflicts. They never would have imagined 230 plus years ago that we would be having the issues that are happening right now between Trump and Biden, but they foresaw in human nature that there could be issues, that there might be problems, that people might not get to that electoral vote, or there might be legal challenges. So even back then, they put these remedies in the Constitution. And this is where, for people that study history, it's fun for us looking back and going, wow, this is actually very similar to issues we've had in the past. And it's also reassuring knowing that America's overcome those issues every single time. And even where we are today, with as much frustration and tension as there is, this is still a process that's being carried out without bloodshed, without violence in the streets. This is not the Abraham Lincoln era Civil War. And so it still should give us hope and optimism that even though there's great political division in our nation, there's great frustration between political parties right now of what's going on, it's still looking like there's going to be a peaceful transfer of power, which should give us hope as Americans, knowing that our American system is still going to carry on, and also assurance that the founding fathers were pretty smart in what they did because their system is still working today.
They always say that history repeats itself, and right, I think, yeah, we do think that this is something new, or, some component is extremely scandalous, but there really is a truth that the problems of human history have always been the problems of human history.
Yes.
Slavery, racial injustice, all these things, they date, like you said, as far back as the Bible, as far back as man. There's always been differences in equality. And so how do we, again, find what's the best solution to move forward, I'm sure is always the pending question. And everybody thinks they have the best solution, but without a framework of history, how do we even know where to jump off of that and move forward?
Absolutely. And so, Grace, for me as a faith-based person, as a Christian, I look at the Bible for guidance in so much of what I do. And arguably the wisest guy who ever lived was King Solomon. He wrote Proverbs. He was really smart. But in Ecclesiastes, Solomon also wrote that there's nothing new under the sun, right? That people think this is the first time it's ever happened. And there's a very famous adage, statement from history, that those who do not know history are doomed to repeat it. And it would be very wise and prudent for us to want to be students of history, because history, it really does give us the best direction for course. It's one of the things if people watching, if you remember having to chart and do graphs. Well, the only way you can chart a graph, you have to know, first of all, where you're starting from and where you want to go. And one of the challenges, even as a nation, if we're saying, hey, we have some goals we want to accomplish. And this is something that I think there's things on in the midst of our political division. There are things that people on both sides of the aisle can agree to. There's some advancements we want to make in the nation. There's some problems that we want to resolve. There's things we want to do better. But the only way you can chart a graph is you have to know where you're starting from and know where you're going, what you're trying to accomplish. And if you don't know your history, you really don't know where you are because you don't know where you've come from. And you can't see that kind of flow in that graph to understand, am I moving the right direction or not? Do we need to be doing something different? And this is where, again, we would advocate as a organization that focuses a lot on American history, is that we really ought to be people who are students of history and go back and look and see what's going on. And I'm just going to take a course deviation for a second, because just thinking about history, one of the things, looking now at Thanksgiving, right? Thanksgiving is right around the corner. One of the things that is becoming very common in America is on almost every major holiday that we celebrate in America, there are now people saying we shouldn't celebrate that holiday because America was really bad in these moments. And this holiday is just a reminder of how bad America is. And there literally are people out there saying that we shouldn't celebrate Thanksgiving. Instead, it should be a national day of mourning because of how the Pilgrims or the Americans abused the Indians. And just so many things now being said about the Pilgrims that don't even make sense. There was an article in the USA Today that talked about the Pilgrims really weren't that religious when they came to America. They really didn't have good relations with the Indians, and a lot of things that would kind of put a damper on thinking about America in any kind of positive light. And I can tell you, for all the history we've studied and looking at America, if there's one people group that you were going to criticize as being not a good people group, to choose the Pilgrims is the worst people group ever, because they were the people who arguably were some of the most honorable people in the time frame in which they lived. When you look at, for example, their relations with the natives, when they get to America, they have the longest lasting peace treaty between any Anglo-Europeans and any natives. It lasted 54 years between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag Indians. When you look at the first Thanksgiving, it was after the first winter, which kind of perspective, they arrived into the New World when they finally find where they're going to build their homes. It's December. And in New England in December, in Texas, we don't really know about this very well, but it's really cold. There's snow on the ground, right? Tough situations. And they were having to find a place to stay. They're trying to build homes. They've actually gone through and consumed most of their food, or it's got what's left is rotten. So they're trying to find fuel and food and shelter. And this first winter, half of the Pilgrims died because of just the conditions, the brutality of the land into which they lived. It was later that year, they end up meeting Squanto, who is this incredible native who comes and helps them know how to survive in the New World. They learn to survive in the New World. When they come to the first Thanksgiving, the Plymouth Historic Society identified that there were 53 Pilgrims who were there at that first Thanksgiving, and they actually have a whole list of their names. And of those 53 Pilgrims, 22 of them were adult age males. Well, Chief Massasoit shows up to that first Thanksgiving, and he brought 90 Indian braves, and actually they provided most of the food for that first Thanksgiving. And what's significant about this is the accusation that the Pilgrims were so mean or mistreated the Indians, or the natives in this case. What's really silly about that accusation is when Chief Massasoit shows up with 90 Indian braves, if the Pilgrims really had been bad toward the natives, if they have mistreated those Indians, Chief Massasoit and his 90 braves are wiping out those 53 Pilgrims, which included men, women, children. There is no Thanksgiving in that regard, but there wasn't a massacre that first Thanksgiving. In fact, there was 3 days of fellowship, feasting, athletic competition, shooting events, wrestling events, races. And the reason they were able to mutually work together is because the Pilgrims were so honorable, and so much of their treatment to the natives, to Chief Massasoit, to the Wampanoags for so long. And again, this is just kind of perspective that we've lost so much of the understanding of history. And today it's so easy to get on Google and do a basic search, and we'll just read the first couple articles that pop up as if those articles are giving an accurate representation of history. And the sad thing is they don't always give an accurate representation of history. And this is where, for us as an organization, we try to go back always to original sources, to original documents, to read the records and reports and the journals of the people who were actually there in those moments. And then we'll read about from what their kids say and their grandkids say. And so we try to gain as much context as we can. And what you discover from reading those original documents is the stories are just much different than much of what is being said today. And I say that in context with looking to Thanksgiving. This is a holiday that has been celebrated in America literally for hundreds of years, and it should be celebrated for hundreds of years because the reason the Pilgrims celebrated after that first winter, when almost half of them died, they actually had a time of prayer saying, God, we need your help. And this is right part of how Squanto comes, and he's part of them, and he helps them, and they survive. That first Thanksgiving wasn't just thanking the Indians for their help and helping them learn to grow crops or learn to fish and learn to survive off the land. It was them taking time to thank God for God's blessing and provision. And it's interesting that half of them had died that first winter. So why are they thanking God? They're thanking God that any of them survived, because they knew that all of them could have died that winter, that there was no reason any of them remained, but they were taking time to thank God. This was something this tradition was continued on. Abraham Lincoln was the president who said that Thanksgiving ought to be a national holiday. FDR was the guy who said we need to have a specific date, because they were celebrating, largely America was celebrating the last Thursday in November. But enter FDR in the 1930s. There were some business owners who said, hey, there were 5 Thursdays this November, and that doesn't give us enough time to rotate our store around from Thanksgiving to Christmas. We need to back that Thanksgiving holiday up. So FDR said, okay, let's do the second from the last Thursday in November. And then people were frustrated in America. There was a big protest. So in 1941, Congress got involved, and they said, let's just make it the 4th Thursday in November, and we'll solve that problem. Well, that's what we still celebrate today, that 4th Thursday in November, which is coming up in just a couple days. But historically, it is a time where Americans have historically thanked God for God's blessing, for God's provision, for God's guidance, for God's hand. And in many years, America hasn't been in a place where everything was bountiful and plentiful. There were many years that were very, very hard. When you think about back in the Civil War years, when 600,000 plus Americans died, they're still having days of Thanksgiving, because what we recognize in America is that God is still doing positive things, even if there are very difficult moments in our life or hard moments in our life. And certainly in 2020, looking at the year of COVID, this is not one of the greatest years of American history. And yet, even in those moments, historically, we as a nation have always remembered to take time and thank God for his blessings, for his provision. And that's part of why this is a federal holiday, going all the way back to the Pilgrims and where that started.
Wow. I knew that it was founded under, or officially made a holiday under Lincoln. We actually did that as a trivia last night in our girls group, but
nice.
I did not know all the rest of that debate between which Thursday should it be. And of course, leave it to the business people to say, hey, it doesn't quite work for us.
Yeah.
That's fun. So tell us about your work today. If anybody were to browse your website, I know you have a radio show that you guys are talking about some of the juicy hot topics of the election fraud. I mean, this is almost something that it's like you probably spent your time studying historical documents. I don't know if your organization will do this, but it makes you wonder who's going to write the historical documents of today and of these moments. And this is clearly a moment of history in some sense, and its uniqueness. So just share just about what your work is and how you guys are engaging with the politics of today.
Yeah, so we are very involved in watching what happens with the election, partly because we have a daily radio program. We have a fairly large social media following. And so we do try to stay active on what's happening in the culture. And over the years, we've done a lot of work in educational arenas. We've done a lot of work in political arenas. And so we have a lot of friends in state legislators. We have a lot of friends who are congressmen, who are senators. And over the years, we've had a lot of friends who have been part of different presidential administrations. And so we are definitely active and engaged in what's happening. And first of all, a little context. One of the very popular things out there is even on social media, whether it be Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, there are some fact checkers, and they will say that, hey, voter fraud doesn't really happen. It's never been widespread. And relatively, that could be true, that it's not widespread. It depends on how you determine widespread or how we're defining that. But as far as historically, okay, historically, there are so many moments and accounts where voter fraud did happen. You can go back. I mean, Lyndon Baines Johnson, right? The fact that he became a U.S. senator, election fraud was the reason he became a U.S. senator. There certainly are moments we can point to historically and show that voter fraud did happen, and it made the difference in the outcome of elections. And that's something that ultimately you just don't want to have happen in a presidential election. We would hope we're the place that in America we have election security, and so we want to make sure that voter fraud is not going to sway what happens in the election. And this should be something that both sides of the aisle ought to be able to agree on, is we don't want somebody chosen illegally or fraudulently that's going to disenfranchise the majority of Americans and who they voted for. And so what we are seeing right now is there's been a lack of transparency in some of these states, whether it be from poll watchers or that's partly why you see these legal challenges. And ultimately at this point, there's some people frustrated saying, hey, legal challenges ought to be over. Trump just ought to concede and let's move on with Joe Biden. Some people are saying, no, there's too many, right? There's too many sworn affidavits, too many eyewitness accounts of fraudulent behavior. And at this point, I would encourage that as Americans, we just need to be patient for a little bit. Let the legal system run its course, because at the end of the day, if there is transparency in what happens, in the sense of if this goes to court, and whether it be Jenna Ellis and Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell, whoever it is that's arguing these in court, if it goes to court and it's shown that they don't have the evidence, well, then there's enough transparency, hopefully, that's presented in court that we're moving on one way or the other. If they don't have the evidence, you go, okay, then we're just going to have to move on and Joe Biden's the winner. Or if they're able to present evidence that voter fraud did occur in widespread areas and levels, whether it be with electronic systems or people bringing in bags full of ballots, as some of these accusations and affidavits affirm, we want to know that, because we want to make sure whoever's the president was chosen in a legal manner. And at this point, there's an awful lot of smoke, and the suspicion always is where there's smoke, there's fire. Now, that's not always true. Sometimes people just make accusations and they're not always grounded in historic truth. And that's, again, something that politically, when you are running a campaign against somebody else, unfortunately, there are people who believe the end justifies the means. And so whatever you have to do to win is what you need to do. And the reality is there are people on both sides of the aisle that would fall into some of those categories. And this is where, at this point, the American people just need to be patient. And let's let the judicial system run its process. Because at this point, the states, when they certify their vote, they choose electors, and then the electors actually go before Congress, and it's certified before Congress. And then finally that vote is confirmed. And then it's not till January that even all of this is confirmed. And so there really is time for some of this court system to take its place. It's not till December 8th that the states are even selecting those electors. Those electors go forward. So this is something that we still have a little bit of time. And instead of everybody getting really emotionally worked up or frustrated, no, we just enjoy the holiday right now. Enjoy family, enjoy Thanksgiving, just love people, right? Let's move past this and let the judicial system have its process, because this is part of the brilliance of what the founding fathers set up. Is they even put in the Constitution the measures that you can judicially proceed if there are issues in the election. And that's part of what's being done now with some of these challenges in states. Again, it seems like there's smoke with just how many sworn affidavits there are from some of these major cities. But are these people making it up, or is this true? Well, this is where you have to go to court and present the evidence. And if there's evidence, then it could change fundamentally what we do, not only in who becomes president now, but maybe how elections are conducted in the future if we're showing that voter fraud happened. But at this point, the burden of proof is on the people accusing voter fraud. They got to show this happened. And as Americans, we just need to keep hanging out. If you're a person of faith, I would tell you, man, you need to pray in these situations. I'm praying that God would help righteousness and justice to prevail in America, because that's ultimately what I would argue our nation needs the most of. Is we need to preserve justice. We want to promote righteousness. And so as a Christian, that's what I'm praying for. And whatever the outcome is, I'm just praying that righteousness and justice prevails. And if we have transparency, if we go through the legal and judicial process, then at the end of the day, we can, as Americans, accept whatever happens. And so that's kind of our big picture take on what's going on.
Awesome. Yeah, you unpacked a lot there. But I mean, like you said, there's a lot of things that both parties, that are nonpartisan things. I think all people want to see true justice,
right,
and truth prevail. And, I mean, right, as a kid, we said the Pledge of Allegiance every single morning. It's with liberty and justice for all.
Right.
And so, that's been my heart. And what I just want to see is that whoever is the true chosen one is the chosen one. That's fine, whether it's Biden or Trump. I'll leave that, to the viewers, to everybody's own opinions, because everybody has one nowadays. But,
yes, they do.
And it's a nonpartisan issue that we all want truth and justice.
Yeah.
And yes, it's obviously a very heated thing, but I also, as a business person, right, we look at the good components of competition within the marketplace. It creates a level of accountability and to call people higher when, there is this level of competition. And I don't like that it is divisive. I would like to see whatever the decision is, the other half, we have to choose to move forward as united, as the United States of America is in our name. But, seeing that there can be inherently good things that come from, and how do we, make, because sometimes you think that issues are one side or the other. Well, only
Sure.
Democrats care about the environment, but there's a lot of Republicans who care about the environment or who care about race issues. And so I think that really there's a whole lot of miscommunication or beliefs there that aren't necessarily true as to, what these things stand for, that a lot of us are actually on the same page, that we want to see true liberty, justice, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness for all people. And so how do we, make that way forward? So
absolutely.
So that's interesting. What else do you have to share on the current events and how we move forward?
Yeah, so I know I think we're supposed to be wrapping up pretty soon, so I'll try to keep my comments relatively short. But looking at the nation, as you mentioned, one of the things that the challenge today is that there's a lot of division that's being promoted, encouraged, and stirred up by sometimes political leaders, a lot of times news outlets, sometimes, even major personalities in America. And ultimately they're saying that if you're on the other side, you're a bad person. And we have to be wiser and more mature than that, right? In families, I mean, many of us grew up with siblings, and growing up with siblings, my gosh, I do not always agree with my siblings. Even to this day, I don't always agree with my siblings. But if anybody messes with my siblings, I will fight anybody on behalf of my siblings, because they're my siblings. And this is the reality of what it should mean to be an American. Is we can have great disagreements, but at the end of the day, we got to be fighting for each other and recognizing ultimately we're on the same team as Americans. And so don't get caught up in letting some news outlet cast us against each other, saying, well, if you voted for this candidate, then you're our enemy. No, you're not. We're not enemies. Ultimately, I think for most Americans, and certainly we can say there's extreme people, there's extreme factions on both sides of the aisle. We can agree to that. But I think for most Americans, we're asking honest questions of how can we make America better? And we might have different ideas and disagreements about how to make America better, but we're asking the same fundamental questions of what can we do better? How can we bring liberty and justice for all? Because some people think, well, it's not there right now. Well, we need to make it better. Okay, how do we do that? If we're going to make America better, it's something that we're going to have to make her better by joining hands and going forward. And this is where, right, being an American shouldn't be about a certain political party or a certain political motivation, a political ideology. It should be about us as Americans joining hands and moving forward together. And this is part of what it is to be a family. And this is really part of the American spirit that, unfortunately, in this very divisive culture we live in, people are being told that if someone disagrees with you, they're a bad person. That's just a really foolish position to take. Just because someone disagrees doesn't make them a bad person. And maybe we just need to engage in more conversation with people that disagree with us so we can get to know them. They can get to know us. We can have honest, truthful conversations. And at the end of the day, you realize, you know what? I disagree with you, but I kind of like you. I think you're a good person. And if we had more honest conversations, we would feel differently than what much of the news media tells us about the other side.
That's so good. I mean, you hit the nail on the head, and it's something that I feel like is part of the message that I try to share amongst the community is, these days, everybody has an opinion and everybody thinks their opinion is right and absolute truth.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that we've lost the characteristic of humility and how to realize, hey, there may be somebody who has a different perspective or who knows something or has experienced something that's different than mine. And so how do we esteem people with honor for their inherent worth and value, above and beyond just what we intellectually think is right? And how do we get back to some of those, core characteristics of humility and honor in order to really, that's what's going to facilitate, the bridge of these conversations being able to happen. Because if we just stay intellectual, we can try and argue facts and this and that, and you can find any fact you want to support your argument these days.
Right.
But, right, just being able to take a step back and let your pride down, be willing to be wrong, be willing to, for another perspective out there to be just as real as yours might be. I think that would, a dose of that might do humanity a large favor. So
absolutely.
I have one other just offhanded comment that, maybe you've thought about this, maybe you haven't, but I mean, have you ever, if you just have just a few more minutes, have you thought about what this is going to look like in history books? Like, will this be the history book of memes? I feel like that's one of the greatest things that, been circulating, whether you agree with all of them or not. There are some really funny memes on toilet paper, on Joe Biden with zombies, or just, what do you think the history books are going to look like for the next generation?
I think honestly, people are going to look back and they're going to kind of scratch their heads about, why did you let things be such a big deal that shouldn't have been such a big deal? I think they're going to go, you guys were so dramatic. You were so emotional, right? Okay. Why was there a toilet paper shortage ever? Like, we don't make any sense sometimes. This is a respiratory virus. Why are you getting toilet paper? But I think ultimately they're going to look back and go, wait a second. There have been pandemics throughout American history. Actually, every 20 or 30 years, there's generally been a pandemic in America. And this has been one of the least deadly pandemics. Now, I'm not downplaying coronavirus, and I don't mean to come across that way, because there's probably people listening that have lost a loved one because of that. I'm not trying to downplay this at all. But when you look at the fact that there's more than a 99% recovery rate from people that get this, most viruses or pandemics that have hit our nation that were serious viruses or pandemics had a much higher fatality rate than does the coronavirus right now. And this is where I think, probably at one point people are going to look back and go, now, wait a second. You closed down all your businesses when there was a 99% plus recovery rate. Like, I'm not sure I understand this. Or even some of, and again, I'm not trying to step on a lot of toes. I'm not trying to be super controversial, but when you have the CDC 1 week saying don't wear masks, they don't help, and the next week saying everybody wear a mask or you hate people. Like, it's just, there's such a roller coaster coming up and down, where the WHO initially said that we need to shut everything down. And then just a month ago, they said, no, you can't shut things down because a shutdown is going to be worse than not shutting things down. We're just flipping back and forth so much in what's going on. And I think future generations are going to look back and go, okay, you guys lacked a leader. You lacked maturity. You were led by emotions. You were led by fear in these moments. And I think, obviously, talking to a chamber for a lot of business owners, we recognize if you are a business owner, one of your primary concerns is the customer, because you need good, happy customers so you can continue in your business. And so we want to be responsible business owners. And yet we recognize that we want to keep a business going. And this notion that the government is able to tell us what businesses are essential and what aren't, when Walmart and Target got to stay open, but mom and pop shops who sell kids' clothes couldn't stay open, there were so many things that seemed very arbitrary happening in the nation. And I think one day people are going to look back and see the arbitrary dictatorial powers that so many governors, that so many mayors took. And they're going to go, okay, you guys were crazy to let that happen. And I'm saying that with the thought and consideration that America doesn't quickly become a socialist nation. Because if we become a socialist nation, then the books are not going to be about how the pandemic was bad. It's going to be about how the pandemic led toward us being really socialist as the outcome. And I'm praying that's not the case. I'm praying that America recognizes that private property in the free market is a much better option than socialism with no private ownership of property or goods. That's yet to be determined, but hopefully that's the case. But I know I'm rambling a little bit, but that's kind of my big picture thought of maybe what history books will write in future generations.
No, that's great. I mean, we've had several people, including, our representative on here, and just saying that there has been a lot of, changing of communication, and wait, we're doing this, but not that. But, and even one of our own platinum members has expressed, like the words you said exactly, who determines what's an essential business or not. And so, right, as a chamber, it is something that these are hard conversations to have, especially right here in the heat of it. But
Yeah.
what will we look back, and how do we create the space to have these meaningful conversations and to facilitate communication? Right, as the chamber, that's our job, is to be the voice of business to government, and to help be that liaison and say, hey, we understand this, but we're not okay with that. And how do we appropriately, professionally communicate those concerns to protect, like we have a video as a chamber, it's called Protect the American Dream. And right, the small business, it is the American dream. It's the heartbeat of America. I forget what percentage, but I mean, some ridiculous percentage of businesses are really mom and pop and family owned.
Yes.
What is it, like 80, 85%?
It's well over 70%, and the number does change a little bit, but yeah, it's probably much closer to 80%, which are the mom and pop shops. And to that point, I would make the argument that everybody who is having to feed their family through their business has an essential business, because that business is essential to feeding their family. So who is the government to tell me my business is not essential? No, my business is essential because this is what keeps food on the table for my family. And we never should let the government can give us recommendations. The government can say, hey, here's what we see. Here's what the stats show. We think you need to be, like even Thanksgiving, where you have governors who are saying you can't have more than 2 families or no more than 10 people. I know some homeschool families who have more than 10 people in their family, right? Like, of course they're going to be together for Thanksgiving. What are you talking about? But I'm afraid we're becoming too comfortable with allowing a government leader to dictate to us how we can live our life in some regards. And so certainly as businesses, this is where I would encourage to push back some of what we're seeing in some of these states where there are much more dictatorial governors that are putting these ridiculous mandates, and businesses are saying, no, we're not doing that anymore. That this is ridiculous. I think we're going to need to see more of that in America to have enough pushback to stop some of this oppression coming from these tyrannical type leaders.
And thank you, because I feel like that's the encouragement that, some people need, right? We're a small chamber. We advocate for a lot of small businesses, and a lot of them don't feel like they have a voice, or that their voice or what they have to say matters. But understanding that, there is power. We are a government in a country that is for the people, by the people, and that, everybody should have a place at the table, whether you're a small minority-owned mom and pop business, that they should have a voice. And get to say, because I've literally sat with business owners and, in confidence, they've, cried or poured their heart out to me that they're between paying their mortgage and paying their employees so that they can pay their mortgage. And so, how do we, balance a very real health, public safety concern, but without making everybody poor, broke, homeless, the mental health issues, all the other, repercussions. And so again, I think that it's there's got to be, some conversations that help us move forward, that we can keep people safe and healthy, but that also we can help our businesses, which by proxy is how families, employees, even if they're not the business owner, the employee themselves is keeping their family fed.
Absolutely.
So that employee should be essential, whether or not a business is deemed essential. So just understanding that we're so interconnected, and that there's such a ripple effect in any one of these decisions. And so thank you, huge thank you for what you guys are doing, the work that you guys are for advocating for business, for, the right checks and balances for government and the people. So I cannot thank you enough. I know that what you guys do is amazing work. So, and I'm going to do a shameless plug. I was trying to pull the picture. I left my book on the bookcase. But Wallbuilders recently released a book called The American Story. It is a pretty thick, packed, juicy probably as compact as you could make the history of the United States. And again, I feel like even some of it's over my head. And you guys have even encouraged me to pick up the original documents, to read for myself through the Constitution, through the Declaration of Independence. And I've had to look up some words as I go, or some phrases, to kind of get a little better context for that old English meaning. But, for anybody who's out there listening, when's the last time you read through your own country's history of the Declaration of Independence and the amendments and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and just encourage, whether it's through a book like what you guys have written. I know you guys have a quite a plethora of materials, but just choosing something to kind of learn a little bit more about our history, and what we stand for, and what has made this country really the world's superpower. We're
Absolutely.
the world's police, we're the world's dominant economic force. That didn't happen by accident. It happened by intention and good leadership. So I just encourage people that, pick up your books, pick up some kind of book, pick up something more than Wikipedia, and, get a dose of history, and be reminded of what made this country great. So
and let me throw one thought. So one of the things that I would encourage people is you study more of American history. And our new book, as you were mentioning, is called The American Story. And we start from Columbus and go roughly through the end of slavery in America. But what we point out is America is not the story of a perfect people. Rather, America is the story of how a perfect God used imperfect people and did great things through those people to advance the causes of freedom, of liberty, of equality, not only in America, but around the world. And that's part of the story that's been lost today. When people talk about America not being a great nation or all the problems we have, it's because they don't actually know the story of America, but also how America impacted and helped bring that positive change around the world. And again, it's not a perfect nation. It's a story of how a perfect God used imperfect people and did great things in this nation. And that's the story of America.
I'm going to just let us be a wrap at that. That was perfect. Thank you so much for your time today, Tim.
Good to be with you. Absolutely.
Website here, wallbuilders.com. You can find them on social media, listen to some of their radio shows, their podcasts. What sources are your podcasts on? Spotify?
Anywhere you download podcasts, you can find ours. We have a radio program on over 400 stations. Our radio website is wallbuilderslive.com, and it'll have links to all our programs, all the radio stations that we're on. So maybe you can find one in your area, but certainly download our podcast on any of the normal places where you get your podcast.
Awesome. And listen to something that might have some richness for your American history. Thank you, Tim. Appreciate your time today.
My pleasure.